Hello everyone and welcome to the Wrestling Freak #1 Wrestling Podcast. I am your host. I am Wrestling Freak #1 and I am here bringing you all the latest news in professional wrestling. This is a follow-up to last night's show where I talked about the CM Punk Colt Cabana Art of Wrestling podcast. In this one I wanted to talk more about the Vince McMahon Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast on the WWE Network. If you haven't watched it yet, it is available on the WWE Network as well as YouTube and StoneColdSteveAustin.com. You can go and listen to it there, any of those three places, or watch it on the network. I talked about this a little bit in last night's podcast, but I really wanted to get into it more. In last night's show, you can go back and watch it. It's the video right before this in my feed. I talked more about the CM Punk Colt Cabana Art of Wrestling podcast, and in this one wanted to cover Vince's reaction a little bit more. And there are a couple of things. One, I was really hoping that they would talk more about CM Punk. They really only covered CM Punk for a little bit. But I thought Stone Cold did a great job in asking the really important questions and just getting right down to the nitty-gritty. Wasn't making any bones about it. He really just wanted to get down and just know what the situation was in WWE and what was going through Vince McMahon's head. Just not just about CM Punk, but WWE, recent WWE in general. So Stone Cold Steve Austin, I thought, did a really good job asking a lot of really important questions about Cesaro, why Cesaro isn't as far up on the roster as he is, and to that Vince McMahon replied, well, it might be the international thing that's holding him back, or it could be that he's Swiss, but he just doesn't have the it factor. And no one in WWE has the it factor, according to Vince, and the last person that reach for that brass ring, the imaginary brass ring, according to CM Punk, was John Cena. And he really put Cena over pretty much through the entire podcast. And so did Stone Cold. Stone Cold kind of put Cena over too. And they also talked about the network, and Vince McMahon didn't really have an answer to why the UK fans still don't have the network. Vince McMahon said, we're working on it. We don't really have a date. Then they went into CM Punk a little bit, and they talked about Punk. And something that I didn't mention in last night's podcast was Vince McMahon actually apologized. He actually apologized to CM Punk for firing him on his wedding day. He said it was just an inter-office thing, and, you know, sometimes you send a message out and you really don't know, you know, a paper's out and you're not really checking a good day for it to get there or anything like that. So he did apologize, and that was very surprising. And going into it, I was expecting it to be a lot more of a work than it was. I wasn't really expecting Vince to, you know, being the CEO of the company, I wasn't really expecting him to shoot as much as he did, and he really did. And they used a lot of backstage terminology, and they really talked about, you know, like planning finishes and stuff like that, which for a show that's airing on the network was kind of surprising. It was kind of surprising that they would go into all those things, especially because Vince, you know, is the master of kayfabe, and, you know, he'll kayfabe anything basically. But it did sort of have that Brett screwed Brett type of feel, which I expected it to. But being that Vince McMahon apologized, you can kind of see the difference between his relationship with Brett in late 1997 and his relationship with CM Punk right now. Not saying that there is a relationship, but you can kind of see just the respect is different, and that Vince McMahon has more respect for CM Punk now than he did for Bret Hart in 1997. You can just kind of see, because Vince McMahon would never, you know, take the blame for anything going back to Survivor Series 97 if it wasn't a work. But that being said, they did touch on a few other issues. Stone Cold did kind of... They didn't really talk about Punk as much as I would like them to have talked about Punk. I was really hoping that there was more about Punk, but it was an hour show, and there was other things that they wanted to get to, but they did touch on Lesnar, and as I mentioned in last night's podcast, he did call Lesnar a special attraction, and he said he's not around because he's a special attraction. And even though he's the champion, that being the champion, well, it doesn't really mean much, I guess, in WWE anymore. And as I said in the last video, you can kind of see where they are now compared to where they were 15 years ago during the Monday Night Wars, and 20 years ago, and on and on and on. They're not the same company that they were. They're a publicly traded company, and that kind of changed them. If it changed them for the better, for the worse, I don't know. I personally kind of think that it changed them for the worse, them becoming publicly traded, because now it's just a huge company. Vince McMahon said that they put Cena over big time. Vince McMahon said that the way to make it in WWE is to not piss anybody off, not piss off any of the writers or anything like that. And there were a few other things, the brass ring, which I mentioned, and no one currently having the it factor, which I think there are plenty of guys. I think Dean Ambrose has the it factor. They did mention Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and Bray Wyatt as guys who potentially have the it factor. So these are things that I just kind of wanted to touch on in this podcast. They talked a little bit about the past and the Attitude Era and different things, and the Undertaker decision, the decision to end the streak. Now, this is Brock Lesnar. You have a guy who has ended Undertaker's streak, and he's not around. Does anyone else but me see the problem with that? I'm sure I'm not alone here. But he's a special attraction. Yay, he's a WWE champion. But it's about the stories. It's not about the title. So that was the Vince McMahon on the Stone Cold Steve Austin podcast. I thought the ending was kind of funny because by the end of the podcast, Stone Cold said, "They're telling me we got 1 minute," and Vince McMahon said, "Well, I own the network. We're doing another 15." And that's when they talked about their match at St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and they talked about working the finish and stuff like that. And it was really more like a typical Stone Cold podcast than it was something that you would see on the WWE network. So it was kind of cool. It was really cool and interesting, and I think wrestling in general, sports entertainment in general is taking a really interesting turn right now, because just like we did during the Attitude Era, we're seeing a lot of real life stuff happen in wrestling, and it's affecting the storylines and affecting what happens. So I think it's really interesting, and whenever something like that happens, it's usually good for the company, and it's good for the fans, because everyone gets interested and everyone gets into it. Again, didn't really talk too much about Punk. Could have covered Punk a bit more. But again, surprisingly, Vince McMahon did apologize for firing him on his wedding day, which I don't know if it was intentional. I don't know. I just recently listened to one of Dave Meltzer's show, and he apparently thinks that it was on purpose. Not saying that I think it was on purpose. It might have been unintentional, but it's a very strange coincidence, if anything. Well, that's going to wrap up this show. Thank you very much for watching. And the next video that I do is probably going to be a how to book a good storyline, a good wrestling storyline video. So watch out for that. So that's probably going to be the next one, unless something major happens in wrestling over the next couple of days. Otherwise, it's going to be the how to book a good storyline, how to write a good storyline in professional wrestling. That is coming up soon. Should be the next one. Again, something major might happen that I might have to cover. Otherwise, that'll be the next one. Alright, so thanks again for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.